She is a research director at Institute for the Future, a 52-year-old nonprofit that helps individuals, organizations, and communities think systematically about the future. Her research explores and reimagines well-being and belonging. She has written for and been quoted in media outlets including NPR and the Fast Company, and writes about the future of belonging at belonging.substack.com. Please help me give a big virtual welcome to Vanessa Mason.
All right, hello, nice to meet everyone. Oh wow, virtual applause, nice. I'm going to hopefully share my screen. Hi, Kat. I know we've interacted a lot on Twitter, so it's great seeing you here. And hopefully, let's see, I'm sharing this screen, and then I need to present. So Valentina, can you see slides? I hope so. I don't know. All right. It looks like I have no notes for some reason, but we're just going to wing it. That's great. Thank you, everyone, for joining me. Thank you for joining me. Really excited to talk to you today about the future of belonging. I'm just going to
We can hear you and we can see you, so it's all good here.
And okay, perfect. So as she said, my name is Vanessa Mason. I'm at Institute for the Future, and I just want to share a little bit about why I'm curious about the future of belonging and why I've been writing about this since the beginning of this year. So one, this is a personal question for me. I see questions of belonging in my own life. I'm someone who grew up in a place that I didn't particularly identify with, that has been in a number of spaces that I didn't feel like I really fit in and always felt out of place. There have been other sort of both in physical spaces in terms of like where I was, as well as kind of identity spaces. I was very religious in high school, and then I wasn't. And then I've also just been someone who's gone along and built kind of niche communities in my adult life for people who are interested in the intersection of tech and public health. And so I think it's definitely a source of personal curiosity for me. But in terms of my work, the question of the future of belonging and why I've been looking at this space is that a lot of my work in futures research involves looking at large undercurrents of long-term change. And so I was kind of surprised and troubled when I started looking at some of these long-term changes in our sort of social behavior or culture as it relates to these questions of loneliness, disaffiliation, and displacement. I think if you've been in this space for a little bit of time, you've seen a lot of news stories about the increase in loneliness, especially in millennials and Gen Z that existed even before this pandemic. In the United States, at least, there's been a history of being affiliated with things like social clubs and social organizations, but membership in those has been decreasing. Religious affiliation has been decreasing dramatically. And then in terms of displacement, of course, when we look at a kind of neighborhood and community level, I think if you've been in any major city, gentrification is a topic of conversation everywhere. But I also don't want us to lose sight of course, as climate change and climate disruption continues to scale, that displacement is going to be something that unfortunately a lot more of us are going to have to handle and deal with. And so when I look at all of these trends, these sort of large underlying currents collectively, I see that we're likely to become more distant, more separated over the next decade. And so my newsletter on the future of belonging was just really thinking about, well, if these are the large undercurrents, how can we not have this be a situation where we are becoming more disconnected? Where are there new opportunities, new ways in which we can reimagine belonging? And so definitely with an eye toward how can we imagine and of course build towards more optimistic futures, while also simultaneously being aware of some of the negative things that might be coming or how we might think about preparing or mitigating and managing these challenges ahead. And so that's really why I looked at this topic today. So my perspective is My undergrad training is in social psychology. I'm also someone who has my master's in public health. So I bring a really kind of huge systems view to this. Also, if you know anyone who does futures research and works in that, you necessarily draw upon a lot of different disciplines. You're thinking at a really large scale systemic level and ultimately trying to pull insights from all of these different areas. And so on to the main event. What is belonging? So I'm going to outline sort of 3 components to belonging that I think are incredibly important to keep in mind. One is this question of safety, that belonging requires both physical safety and psychological safety. And I really like to think of this both in terms of those 2 components, but also this sense of comfort that we feel in just being around people. I think we all feel the acute loss of gathering, of people, of whether it's dancing, whether it's family meals, like those opportunities to just be around people who know us, reinforce that feeling of safety. That's really core to belonging. And I think in a sort of tech sense, I thought it was really actually interesting, like John Maeda, the designer who was first designer, I believe in residence at Kleiner Perkins, the venture capital firm, recently launched a platform that really is around play on Mark Andreessen's word, rather than software eating the world, he's talking about safety eating the world, really underlining just how incredibly foundational it is to have safety, both for the belonging and also as we look towards the world over the next decade. This second component, that sense of emotional connection, you can really think of this as, the friend, the family member, the romantic partner, that when they see you, they get you, that they understand you on some level. And I also think you can conceive of this in a kind of existential or philosophical sense, that whether it's the universe, a higher power, regardless, that there's sort of this more larger scale entity that sees you, that it remembers you, that it's kind of understanding what your purpose is and where your place is in the world, and knows that you are there. So this emotional connection both to our interpersonal relationships as well as sort of to the larger scale sort of society and world that we belong to as well. And then contributing to this as well on kind of a larger scale too, is that belonging is a source for meaning and sense making, that it is in conversation and connection with the people who we are closest to, as well as the people who belong in our communities and our society, that become a vehicle for us really understanding, why are we here? What are we doing? What does this all mean at the end of the day or at the end of our lives? So it's these 3 components of belonging that I want you to keep in mind as I move forward today. And so this graphic I shared on my newsletter, really trying to add a little bit more nuance to this, but I think it really encapsulates the 3 sort of components of belonging that I outlined before. So that sort of sense of safety and comfort really is this first ring, that this is about the people who are nearest and dearest to us, the people who we live with, our closest friends, our family, and then the people who are sort of in the places that we frequent the most. This next circle around networks and communities are really around that emotional connection. Like, do I feel related to someone because they also like to knit? Do I feel connected to someone in my network because they're part of my alumni network? These sort of new ways of arranging, like people who are kind of like us, who are kind of close to as a result of who we know of them and what we can infer about them, but are less necessarily more distant. And then this sort of outer container that really is kind of, you can think of as like the infrastructure for all of this. So what are the stories? What are the narratives? And what are the sort of culture? What are our values? What is the ethos that really underlines like who belongs, under what circumstances, and how is that belonging built and reinforced over time, over space, and in the face of adversity? So turning to this question of how can tech build belonging, I really want to outline 3 principles that have come out of the research that I've done thus far, and highlight a few companies as well that really encapsulate this. So these 3, I'm going to go through these in more detail, but 1, belonging happens by design and not by accident. Two, that belonging is moving from being more fixed to being more mutable. And that ultimately this third principle, that really tech that is building belonging needs to be and is becoming more relational and less transactional. So to start off with this principle that belonging happens by design and not by accident, if for any of you, again, going back to psych nerds, of which I definitely am one, it's a common bias called the fundamental attribution error, that we attribute a lot of the behavior that we see, the sort of the why behind the behavior we see, to the individuals that we see exhibiting that behavior rather than to our environments. And so when we look back to the past, it's really easy to see where this principle was true when we think about belonging, and that the spaces where we belong, so it might have been religious affiliation, the towns that we were in, mobility was a lot more constrained, the sort of social acceptance, the sort of narrative and culture around certain identities was particularly constrained. And that because of these constraints, there simply were fewer choices. You kind of belong just because of where you were born or where you could be or where you couldn't be. It was a function of your physical environment that particularly put you in particular places. And so you belonged because you had no other choice. You needed that safety that came from, adopting that identity, whether you sort of felt like or really wanted to or wanted to affiliate with that. But I think what's happening now is that we find ourselves immersed in what's called the paradox of choice. We simply have so many options for spaces, opportunities, identities, relationships, so many spaces, so many communities, and like with all the mobility to be able to freely move among all of those spaces, places, and people, which ultimately is good because, of course, none of us want to really go back. Well, I guess some people in the world want to go back to that past, but I think generally people who are part of this talk don't want to go back to a past where there were situations where people didn't fit with the options that were available. But this does come with a cost of having to make certain choices about belonging, and that you have to design these spaces, you have to design those relationships where that's actually occurring. So one example that I want to show is that one way that tech can build belonging in this particular dimension and being by design is that tech can really facilitate some of the kind of hyper local or sort of micro kind of connections that we all have. And so one space that I like to look at this is in mutual aid. I think that all of us, that was a term obviously that wasn't very common along with social distancing 6 or 7 months ago. But I think what's so amazing about this, and that this is now more mainstream, is that people are rediscovering their communities. They're rediscovering just what's right around them and looking at it with new eyes, and are building sort of new relationships all the time and in completely different ways than they did before. They're getting to know their neighbors. They're getting to sort of really understand the labor that's required for a community to actually be a space where belonging happens, rather than just merely being co-located next to someone because you're in the same apartment building or in the same neighborhood. And so with this work becoming more visible, there's platforms like We the Peeps that are really trying to unlock a lot more of this kind of hyper local, sort of more micro connections by allowing local residents to build decentralized autonomous organizations to raise cryptocurrency for local causes as they see them. So this can be as small as, we want to make sure that the senior in our apartment building is safe in the case of heat waves, or it could be as large as, we really want to be able to fund a park so that we have green spaces so that people can be happy, have safe places to walk, be healthy. And really it's this, again, this ability for tech to facilitate those sort of micro, hyper-local connections. I think there's been so much of this in mutual aid that's come forward, and hopefully it will continue to sustain itself over time, that I think is really incredibly promising for where we can see tech building belonging more by design. The second principle that I want to highlight is that belonging is moving from being fixed to being mutable. So again, going back to the past and talking about how social identities were constrained, they also were something that stuck with you for life. You didn't really hear about people becoming less religious or not really feeling like they were Catholic anymore. Now it's a running joke. I have other lapsed Catholic friends. And so I think that the sort of, and it's not just about religion as well, I think this mutability is relevant across time, across space, across these connections to broader systems that we have, to our communities, to the networks that we belong to, because all of our institutions have become far more decentralized and far more distributed. Now, of course, there are plenty of examples of the opposite shift happening, where people are trying to, in a sort of backlash, trying to move towards more control and more centralization. But generally, the shift over time is for things to be more fluid, more mutable. And that because of that, you don't just find spaces or relationships where belonging is one and done. I don't know if anyone here watches the show Insecure, but I love that it's showing female friendships and how they change over time because of life stages, because of maturity. Certainly if you've maybe lost friends because you've moved, and it's just, you don't necessarily kind of end up in a space or in relationships where you belong. You necessarily have to keep reinvesting in those communities that you're in, continuously reevaluate what your role is in there. Are you contributing to the health of those? Or are they sort of maybe taking away from the health of you? This applies, of course, to organizations, like thinking about how organizations can be restructured, how the sort of broader operating system around those can adapt and evolve to really respond to this quality of mutability that we're now handling. Now, to put some definitions around this, I'm going to talk about OnlyFans because I love that there have been so many articles about OnlyFans. If you're not familiar to this, this was originally founded for creators to easily monetize premium content, but of course, as many of you know, if you are familiar with OnlyFans, has attracted sex workers. And so it's been really great for them. They're looking for more legitimate, more convenient ways to work in light of what is now the pandemic, but before was the closure of things like Backpage and in the face of regulation like SESTA and FOSTA. So just to give you a sense of how big OnlyFans has gotten, just even in the last 6 months, they recorded a 75% increase in what they call model signups, so creators on their platform just in April. It's certainly something that has cultural cachet. Beyonce name checks OnlyFans in the Savage remix. And so you would look at this and think, like, wow, like, now even sex workers have the ability to own their product and own what they're selling. They have the ability to be more free of harassment. They're generally making more money, many more views. This is sort of, it would suggest a lot of mainstreaming, and that really exhibiting what I'm talking about here, and that tech that's building belonging can accelerate social change. It can dramatically shift social norms, and even in arenas like sex work, which have been since the beginning of human time that I'm aware of, simultaneously demonized, but also patronized. That said, with the growth in OnlyFans and popularity, it's also attracted celebrity talent. So Bella Thorne is on OnlyFans, earning $1 million in 24 hours. Cardi B is on there. There's a number of different social media influencers also flock to the platform. And in a certain sense, it does help with the sort of shift towards social norms being more open and more expansive. But it's also come at the cost of sex workers saying, hey, well, now that these sort of socially acceptable people are doing it, my own work is losing value by virtue of being proximate to social legitimacy. And so, with acceleration comes these trade-offs, comes these dilemmas that something can be simultaneously more mainstream while also still facing some level of being not socially acceptable. And third and last, tech that builds belonging is relational and not transactional. So I like to think of this as the thought exercise of what if you looked at your phone and rather seeing app icons, so looking at logos, you were able to see faces of people. And so I did a version of this on my phone a few years ago because I wanted to get out of a space where I was just being notified by apps just for the sake of engagement, and wanted to be engaged with people. I wanted to be reminded of my relationships, and I wanted to bring a certain level of intentionality and attention towards those relationships. And I think this is where tech that builds belonging can really shine. One example of a recent YC company that came out that I really want to talk about is Artifact. They basically pair professional interviewers with family members who use this as an opportunity to record stories. And so I love this sort of, you can kind of think of this as as a second generation 23andMe on Ancestry.com, it's another way of thinking about family data in a way that is more qualitative, that's less reductionist, that's really about trying to capture narrative and folklore, and particularly through this medium of voice that is necessarily more evocative and more emotional, that goes way beyond notions of base pairs and like lines on a family tree that you might have done while you were in elementary school. And I think it's that attention to relationships, not just in quantity, but the quality, the sort of depth, and the, again, that emotional content that really is showing like the power of technology to build more like relational exchange rather than transactional exchange. Another way is that this is a recent research experiment that basically showed that you can use technology to literally help people feel like they have switched bodies. That they used XR to basically put two people who were friends and in the sense kind of immerse them in a sensation where they felt like they could look down and see the body of their friend, which is a very weird thought experiment. If you've met any academic researchers, I love that they come up with these things. But what's so fantastic about this is that this research question found that you could shift someone's sense of self by really just having them experience someone else's body for a few minutes. And so I think rather than, I feel like this opportunity for us to really use technology in a way that allows us to really and truly be in the place of other people, to understand our relationship more broadly to other folks, has this opportunity to expand empathy and really demonstrate our interconnectedness in a way that we have never, ever been able to do as humans. It's also scary as hell, because I think if anyone's looking on the news and seeing the constant headlines about disinformation and misinformation, imagine if people were experiencing in a very immersive and evocative sense the fear that comes with a lot of misinformation and disinformation. So there's definitely this potential for abuse, but I do think that, again, with this sort of eye towards being aware and being intentional about what tech, with an eye towards building belonging, that we do have this opportunity to not just imagine a better world, but we can also immerse ourselves in creating that better world. So I realize I ran a little bit late, but these are just the key principles that I outlined. I hope that this was helpful, and happy to maybe take a question.
All right, thank you so much, Vanessa. Big round of applause for Vanessa. Well done. The clapping just happens.
It just happens.
People are really good at clapping today. All right, we've got time for a few questions. So I'm going to head over to the chat and let's see. Does anyone have any questions for Vanessa? We've got a few minutes.
I think I saw, nerding out with me, thank you. I think I saw someone, Melanie. Oh, here we go.
Oh, there we go. We are a tech company trying to solve belonging through a new type of empathy-driven community engagement platform. Any advice on what is missing out there?
Yes, I would say that if anything, as troubling as the end of May and June with a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests were happening, I think what was so amazingly remarkable about it is that it was issuing both new language and new rules around how do you actually do that kind of deep listening when it, either may feel very personal or very close to home. And so I think just setting expectations around, because we don't have a shared history, that people literally define empathy in different ways. Like some folks think, well, if I just tell you what's going on, then I just expect you to, explain and correct me and be my teacher. And so I think having some way of evoking content is a way of doing this, rather than just like, I'm just going to engage you with dialogue and you only see what's in front of you, really to think about sort of a historical piece of it. So like one way, as I didn't share this example before, there's a researcher at Columbia, I believe she's in the School of Social Work. Her name's Courtney Cogburn. She produced a 12-minute VR experience that follows a he's a black boy, so it goes from being a child to an adolescent to an adult. It's a 12-minute VR experience, but what it shows is that like much more than just looking at him as a boy, like there's the history of like his day-to-day interactions and like how racism shows up in like throughout his life course in the space of 12 minutes. And so I think being able to demonstrate that context, the sort of day-to-day, those micro interactions that people have, really are helpful for people to really understand, I think, empathy more beyond, now I've jumped into a conversation. I think that the history is necessary.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right, we're going to do two very quick questions. Kate says, how can you move a community strategy from transactional to relational when the leadership may be entrenched?
Yes, that's always a hard one. I think it's, in the 60 seconds, one, find spaces where there are maybe possible areas of alignment. So I don't know what company or what community strategy that you're in, but if your leadership strategy is the transaction is they're just looking for more revenue, where can your relationships build with your customers? I think that's where you can kind of start to justify a little bit where those spaces might be in those kind of investments. I also think too that you necessarily need to just start beating the drumbeat of having a long game on expectations. I think leadership, especially transactional, is always increasingly justified at like, well, you need to increase every quarter. So how can you start trying to lengthen the timeline out? And because relationships require time, like it requires building trust, and that necessarily is an investment. So how can you embed that, the sort of timing expectations as well?
Great. Okay. There's only one more question, so I hope we can get through this. So Robin says, how do you ensure people who feel belonging in a community do not become exclusionary to new members or different POVs?
I love what Priya Parker says about gathering, that she says, you have to be a good host. And sometimes being a good host means kicking people out. I don't necessarily think that, and that's why I love like talking about this question of belonging. It doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is there, because you do need to create safety. So yes, to protective exclusion. So I definitely want to highlight that. I think the second thing is that like, build your community in a way where people feel vested in the rules and the practices and relationships that people would want to be in there. And so, don't just, sorry, my mind just went blank for a moment. And all that is to say is that like, you want your community to kind of, police itself, and I don't want to use the word actually police, but you want your community to relate for itself. You want people to be bought into wanting a community that they want to be part of, that they want to invite people who are also going to add to the community in that way and be self-reinforcing. And so building that practice of, this belongs to all of us. And because of that, you bear some responsibility. Like you're not just here just to lurk, you're also partially here to contribute to this community existing as well. And so I think in that sense, it helps with new members who are either unsure about how they join and what their different points of view might be, or also could help in the education process too.
Great answer. Thank you. All right, we are out of time, everyone. Thank you so much again to Vanessa. If you want to connect with her, I'm sure she's happy to connect with you on all of her social channels. I'm going to be back here in a few minutes with somebody else. So I will see you very soon. Thank you, Vanessa.
Great. Thank you. Bye.